This week on Q&A, our guest is historian Joyce Appleby, author of the new book on the history of capitalism called The Relentless Revolution.
Joyce Appleby, why did you call the book on the history of capitalism The Relentless Revolution?
Because that's really what the history of capitalism has been. One revolution in social arrangements, technology, workplaces, areas of profit, production centers. It's just been one revolution after another. I think Schumpeter, Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, said it well, that capitalism is about creative destruction. And we get the creative part, which is wonderful, all these new technology, but we sometimes forget the destructive part. Every invention that succeeds wipes out its predecessor, and this means a change in where people work and the skills they have to have. And it never stops. I mean, as we know, having lived through 2008 and 2009, we had sort of this whammy out of nowhere. I mean, now we realize it wasn't out of nowhere, but that's what it seemed like. And that's a part, I would say, of the Relentless Revolution, going from a great boom time to a burst bubble.
Define capitalism.
I define capitalism as a system in which private individuals take initiatives with their own capital to usually to enhance production, but to produce something that they can sell on the market for a profit. And I give that definition, and it seems so ordinary, and yet every element in that definition was an affront to the established customs and traditions of the society in which capitalist practices began.
Give us an example of what was an affront. Break it down.
Individual initiative. In a society of scarcity, which all traditional societies were, they were always under the threat of famine. You didn't have a lot of individual initiatives. It was like a sinking ship. You stayed in your place and you did what you were told because they were so close to the edge in their capacity to produce food. So that individual initiative would seem very dangerous. And then the idea of its being private, extending the private sphere. This was a traditional economy in which the government didn't produce things, produced on land that was owned by yeomen or lords or whatever, and worked by tenants and some private farmers. So it was privately owned, but the government controlled it. These great laws against regrading, forestalling, and one other, which is meant that when the crop was in, you couldn't hold it off the market for a better price. You couldn't sell it to brewers if the government said that they needed it for food. You had to take it to the market on a certain day and sell it. So that was a lot of control, but now you have private capital going where the owner of it wants it to go. And those are just very disruptive things. Enhancing production is another way. You don't enhance production without assaulting old customs and ways of working.
So go back to the very beginning. Can you put a date on it, when it started, and where did it start?
No, I can put a century on it. It started in England, and as you know, I don't think capitalism was inevitable. I think it was a very propitious convergence of trends and developments and some fortuitous events. I put it in the 17th century because the core of capitalism was discovering developing new machines on the basis of the new science that greatly accelerated the amount that could be produced by any worker. And this work was done it's what we think of in the natural philosophers of Galileo and Newton and Boyle, and they discovered that atmosphere had weight, and they discovered that there was no that there was a vacuum, that natural laws are uniform, and these ideas, as I say, might have just maintained within an intellectual elite, but in England had a very open society. And so these advances in science just advanced right into the workshops of a Thomas Newcomen or a James Watt, who perfected the steam engine. I mean, I just think, how many people through the ages must have seen boiling water push up the top. So, you know, and yet it took all these centuries for what? For the theories that explained it, for the mechanics who had the ingenuity and desire. It was a propitious linking of technological advances with economic opportunity in a very supportive social environment. But England had already solved the problem of food shortages, and that was key. Didn't cause capitalism, but it made it possible.
You also throw, that's not the way to say it, a bone to the Dutch.
Oh, definitely.
Why? What role did they play?
The Dutch were great innovators, but the Dutch were financiers and traders. That's what they did well. They acquired in Amsterdam, the cities of the Netherlands, they just had storehouses of everything beautiful that was made in the world, as well as timber and grain. They made themselves the great carriers of the world, and they innovated with banking and finance. They had interest rates of 2, 3, 4%, when everywhere else in the world it was 12%. Well, of course, this is what startup companies need. They need access to capital at a low rate. So the Dutch were important, but the Dutch had one problem. They could only feed themselves through 9 months of the year, so they had to import for 3 months of the year. And this, I think it crimped their imagination. I don't think they could see the possibilities of the systems that they had started, whereas the English exported food. They were well enough developed in agriculture that they didn't have to worry after they'd gone through this century of improvements. The Dutch also were satisfied. They were you know, fat and happy, so they weren't pushing to change what they did well. What was remarkable about England and why you have capitalism is that once they started, they never stopped. They kept innovating with new developments, applying it to different productive processes, you know, everything from drilling mining shafts to making porcelain.
Let's review your background. We talked on this program 10 years ago. Year 2000.
Was it 10 years ago? Right.
For one of your books, and you pointed out that you were born in Omaha, Nebraska.
Omaha, Nebraska.
But you've lived in Kansas City, Missouri. You've lived in Dallas.
Dallas.
And
Evanston.
Evanston, Illinois. What were you doing in your father was in corporate?
My father was worked for United States Gypsum, and he was in sales, and he was actually moving to bigger offices.
But you ended up in California, and you went to Stanford. Mm-hmm. Where did you get your master's degree? I
got my master's degree at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I was there, living there with my husband, and we had an ad agency in Santa Barbara, and I was very lucky because they just initiated a master's program, or I would not have been able to get it.
And what about your PhD?
I got that at Claremont Graduate School, and again, it was within 10 miles of my house. By this time, I had 3 children, so I had a very short tether. But fortunately, it extended to a place that provided graduate education.
Didn't you have a son that played a role in this book?
I did. I do.
What do you do?
He's sort of a man of leisure. He learns and remembers. He's kind of fantastic what he knows, and it was just wonderful. He lives near me. It was wonderful to be able to talk to him about this because he never, ever lost his curiosity in capitalism, and I would bring up some subject, and he would go on to amplify. I think I mentioned that Sarnoff went to Japan and was celebrated. Frank was one that told me that he was the one that received the message from the Lusitania. I mean, just always these little things that are kind of fun.
The founder of RCA and
yes,
NBC.
Yes, right.
But go back, you taught at San Diego State University.
I taught there for 14 years, and then I came to UCLA.
And 1981, and are you still teaching?
No, I retired 7 years ago.
So go back to this. How did you go about? When did you start this book, and how'd you go about researching it?
I started it. It took me 2 years, and then there was a copy editing process. So I guess I started it now maybe four years ago this summer. I knew a lot about the first part because I'm an historian of early modern Europe, and I'd done a book on economic thought in England, which meant that I had to understand economic developments as well. And then after that, when we got into, well, you get into the Industrial Revolution, I was by no means an authority on that. I simply read. I did what scholars did. But the interesting thing was that I never thought of it as a book for scholars. I thought of it as a book for a general public, and that was so liberating. I didn't think of all those critics who were going to be arguing with my thesis. I just thought of general readers eager to learn about the history of capitalism, and it truly was fun to write.
Do you remember when you were surprised that you didn't know? I mean, you've studied history all your life, but you didn't know something you found out about capitalism.
Yes, there were a lot of things, a lot of things. I mean, I didn't know, for instance, much about Germany in the 19th century, and yet when I saw that both the United States and Germany had passed the front leader, the pioneer, England, I became very interested in how the Germans did this. And what was curious and what made a real impression on me as I developed the book was how different the United States' economic development and political development too was from that of Germany. So here were these two different paths towards capitalist leadership and excellence, with different strengths, different leaders, truly a different MO. And that made me realize that because capitalism, as I stress, is a cultural system, it wears a different face in every country.
Well, explain the difference between the Germans and the Americans.
Well, the Germans, for instance, were struggling, well, the Prussians were struggling to create a nation in Germany, and they started off with the Zollverein, they started off with a customs service, and so they used the economy to create this unity, which they finally, through Bismarck, they finally achieved with Prussia, which was by far the largest of the 300 principalities and states that composed Germany. And because they were led by aristocrats, this is one of the interesting features, well, let me just back up. The aristocrats were not particularly interested in industry. They were interested in German prosperity, but they had a rather contempt for these industrial magnates. And so the industrial magnates couldn't count on the government for financing or banks. And so they arranged to have investment banks. The first investment banks were in Germany, in a couple of major cities. The other thing was that the Germans had the center of industry was in the Northwest, and they had to pull people from the poorer parts of Germany as workers in these factories, in the steel factories and the like. But there began to be unrest among the leaders, and here's one of the big differences I'm getting to. I haven't forgotten the question. There was an attack, an attempted assassination of the Kaiser, and so there was a clampdown on radicalism, but Bismarck initiated a social welfare program in the 1880s. Workers' insurance, workers' compensation, pensions, and the like. He wanted to buy off, as it were, the radicals. And because he had power, he wasn't stopped by the industrialists who hated this sort of thing. They weren't interested in securing all these benefits for workers. Well, you look at the United States, and we have a very porous safety net. We never have had strong unions, and that means that our social welfare, as we know going through healthcare debate, it's been very hard to push on this front. So that's one of the big differences.
What other than farming started capitalism? What was the first industry?
Mining.
Where?
In England, mining was important, and they needed pumps first to get rid of the water, and then the steam that fills in mines, and steam engines were more they could use as effective pumps. The initial use of steam, the Newcomen steam engine, just consumed enormous amounts of coal. So you couldn't leave the coal fields very far. You had to have your industry there, and mining was there. What James Watt does, half century later, as someone said, he took an awkward contraption and turned it into the engine of the Industrial Revolution, is he got a way of getting rid of all that steam and conserving on the coal. Then you could take the steam engines and put them anywhere, in boats, to drive the machinery in Wedgwood's famous porcelain factories. And so the first is in the late 17th century, and I'm carrying it forward to the end of the 18th century. And it doesn't really change the standard of living until well into the 19th century.
What was next then? You had mining?
Mining, and then
steam.
The great bonanza of the steam engine was textile making. Textile making, cotton was a lot easier to mill than wool, and cotton was in demand all over the world. And the English perfect through the spinning jenny, the power loom, the spinning mule, these various inventions improve the number of spindles that can be run at the same time with the same engines, and greatly accelerate the output. So most of England's industrial workers worked in textile factories. That's one of the sort of poignant moments in American history, to jump ahead to the 19th century, is that in the Civil War, the English were cut off from Southern cotton. They refused to recognize the Confederacy. And the workers are all thrown off out of the factory, no jobs. And there is a pressure to get the government to recognize, from the manufacturers to recognize the South. And the workers stand fast, even though they are suffering. They do not want to help slavery. And Lincoln wrote a wonderful letter to them, and it's on the base of a statue of him in Manchester. It's getting a little off field, but there's so many kind of fascinating stories inside this epic.
You wrote this. I have to say I was surprised only because a historian doesn't normally say things like this. I should also place myself on the contemporary ideological continuum. I am a left-leaning liberal with strong, if sometimes contradictory, libertarian strains. Why did you put that one? I mean, somebody reading this, all of a sudden you've labeled yourself.
I guess I thought that it would be well for the person to know who was talking to them and telling them this story. And as I said, I wrote it for a general audience. I think people are curious when you deal with a subject like capitalism. I went on to say that I very much wanted to write this without having characters with black hats and characters with white hats, and sing the virtues of capitalism or lament its abuses. I wanted to give, not even-handed, I just wanted to give an account that sort of like the Sergeant Friday that told the facts, though obviously I interpret the facts all the way through to give it a coherence. What, did it seem strange to you?
No, the only reason so often either journalists or historians will say, I'm just a historian, I'm not on one side or the other. And you never know until somebody says what they are here. Right. Well, let me probe you a little bit on the both left-leaning liberal and libertarian. Where do you come down on, what makes you a libertarian? On what issues?
Well, welfare reform. Say, what's that got to do with libertarians? I disliked the dependency that I felt was implicit in our welfare system, and that I see as a libertarian of wanting people to be free of this kind of dependency. There are quite a few issues in which freedom would be more important to me than social justice in some instances. Social justice is very important. What was I reading about today? I was an issue this issue about the school, Hastings. The case is coming before the Supreme Court. Hastings told the Christian League, Students' Christian League, that they could no longer have university facilities or law school facilities because they excluded people whose sexual life was immoral. And I was thinking, I think they ought to have the right to exclude. I think that's a right of free association. It doesn't seem to me that it's damaging a lot of people. I don't know whether that seems like a libertarian issue to you, but I'd weighed against the institution.
How about the other side, left-leaning?
Oh, well, left-leaning is a lot easier. I'm really, really concerned with social justice. I think it's abominable that we don't pay a living wage. That is, when we start paying a living wage to workers all over the world, I bet half of our social problems will be gone. Poverty is it's just a bane of people's lives, and there are a lot of people who are poor. I mean, it's not a small number. And so I guess being for the living wage is different from not wanting welfare. I want people who work to be able to earn a comfortable living. And I think if you have such an unequal society as we do, the government's got to put money into public goods like concerts for kids and art education and parks and the things that they can't get from upper middle class parents. The government, in that sense of enrichment of a childhood, should be doing that. And that's sort of liberal.
So where do you come down on capitalism? For or against it?
Oh, I'm for it. I'm for it. Capitalism has got a great wealth generating capacity. We just have to learn. We have to do this delicate balancing act of making it, regulating where it needs to be, but without killing the incentives that fuel it.
How do you do that?
Well, you know, we didn't do such a bad job after the Depression. We can see now that all that deregulation was a mistake. I think that we can get our financial house back in order. I think there'll always be panics or bubbles burst. The reason why there will always be is because capitalism is a system in which no one is in charge. Many people have a lot more power than other people, but no one's in charge. So you can have everybody running off a cliff at once and not know it. I don't think it's that difficult to regulate it. I don't think you're going to do it perfectly. You're going to have to adjust it with changes.
Read you back some of what you said about contemporary capitalism and its critics. You said, you talk about greed, but you say, nor is greed the only thing that people hold against capitalism. I've made a little list, and it includes such charges as responding to short-term opportunities to neglect the long-term effects, dispensing power without responsibility, promoting material values over spiritual ones, commoditizing human relations, monetizing social values, corrupting democracy, unsettling old communities, institutions, and arrangements, and rewarding aggressiveness and, yes, greed. Go back to that whole area that you're talking about there. What were you trying to get at?
Well, that, as I said, I made a little list, and that list in part comes from people who are fighting against capitalism, who are critics of capitalism. Amartya Sen, or Muhammad Yunus, or Francis LePay Moore. I mean, all those are charges that are made against capitalism. The anti-globalization people say that. I thought it was important to get those all out there because I think they are aspects of capitalism. If we had the political will, we could address every one of those. Maybe not the rewarding aggressiveness, because I later thought I should have dropped that, because aggressiveness is important to capitalism. But what we lack is the political will to make these changes. And one of the reasons I think we lack this political will is because we've been sold the bill of goods that the economy is an independent system. It's autonomous, self-correcting, works on its own. It's like the weather. Don't try to interfere. I just don't think that's so. It's a cultural system. There's much that we can do to shape it. And this is what I would like to see.
Greed, good or bad? And what role does it play in capitalism?
Oh, I think we can see it. When you've got 40% of the Ivy League graduates going into finance, as we had up until 2 years ago, you'd have to say is wanting a very high salary greedy? If so, I think that we'd say the money attracted the people. No, I don't think greed is particularly good. I think moderation. It's like the Greeks and their golden rule, is that there's a desire to live comfortably and to work to achieve that. But I think that what we see with greed is when other human values are out of bounds, out of kilter, because the greed is so dominant. Then we're not thinking about the time that we had to enjoy our family or to do. I realize enjoy the family is what politicians always say when they resign, but people do want to enjoy their family. And so I think the greed, as As an excess, yes.
Talked about Germany, Great Britain, the Dutch. Who else in the world have been great capitalists?
Well, we see two very unusual countries representing 40% of the world's population, India and China, coming along. Of course, the other one is Japan, much earlier. And I think that Japan moved. It's a really rather small island and not that populated, and it's the #2 economy for a long time. That was quite a story. And the Asian story generally, the Four Little Tigers of Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, they modernized and developed capitalism even faster than Japan. And they all did it, interestingly enough, with a highly directive elite. One of the things that all those countries did, too, was that they had agricultural reform. They got the land out of the hands of passive landlords, put it in the hands of the farmers, poured back money into agricultural education, and as it were, kind of bought off any critics of their industrial project because the farmers were doing very well. And then those leaders knew what they had to do to connect with the, in this case, the emerging world of consumer electronics and information technology.
You single out 3 printed works in your book. 1, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, 2, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and 3, The Declaration of Independence. Let's start with the first one. Tell us about Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, and why did you pick that first?
Well, of course, it's the kind of analysis and synthesis of capitalism. It was published in 1776, and Adam Smith was a philosophy professor, and he was a Scotsman, and there was a lot going on in Scotland at the time, and he had this capacity to just look at this mass of separate little facts and bring them into an organized story of a free economy. This is what he was interested in. He didn't call it capitalism. And he explained how capitalism emerged and long accumulation of capital and then the application of the division of labor that enhanced production. And it laid the basis. It laid the basis of economics. It was furthered by David Ricardo and Malthus and other people. But it also laid the basis of this self-correcting economy. Of course, Adam Smith is the one that had the idea of the invisible hand. He said, you know, it's not from benevolence that we get bread and beer from the brewer and the baker. It's from their own self-interest in competing to produce a good product at a lower price, and we benefit. And that's been kind of the linchpin of defenders of capitalism ever since. That yes, they have this competition, but there's this invisible hand that makes that competition works for us. And Smith has wonderful anecdotes. He says, for instance, manufacturers never have dinner together but what they set the price of wages. It's a very ironic way. At a time in which workers, if they had tried to conspire to have an association, would have been sent right off to jail. So he has this, he's no dummy, he knows what's going on in this world. And so I would say, I guess I got interested in the subject through Adam Smith. It's just a wonderful book.
When did you read Wealth of Nations first?
I read Wealth of Nations, I guess, early in graduate school. I probably read extracts in college because I did take some economic courses. But I was a graduate student. I would have been in my early 30s.
Did you have to go back and read it again for this book?
No. No, because this isn't about economics. That's very important. It's not about economic theory. It's about the development itself, the actual transitions, the actual conflicts, novelties, innovations, struggles over these that gave shape to the capitalism we have today.
Back in 1776, what impact did Adam Smith's book have then, and has it grown in value and importance over the years?
It's interesting, it had very little impact on the United States. Alexander Hamilton said the idea that markets can run themselves is one of those paradoxical notions that has grown in strength with us during the Revolution. It absolutely had nothing to do with it. But it was important in England, and it moves into the early 19th century to become the basis of economic thought. And then economics changes in the end of the 19th century, and they no longer have a labor theory of value. They have a theory that value comes from demand. It's what we will pay when we are just about satisfied with an object, what we won't buy another one for. Anyway, so Adam Smith has not been important in modern economic theory, except as a sort of a godfather and as a totem, as a symbol, as a name with resonance. So I would say Smith is still important, and I'm sure he's taught in most economics classes.
Second on your list is Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Another Brit.
Another Brit. Well, you know, he was another American immigrant, too, because he thought he was going to stay. He didn't know they were going to have all these wonderful revolutions that would call him back to Europe. Paine was important because Paine had this, he had such a powerful attack on privilege and political conservatives and traditions. And he was such a polemicist that he really did open people's eyes to the incongruity of being ruled by ideas that are 800 years old or political arrangements. And of course he had an impact on the American Revolution because he came here and immediately, first thing he did was write a tract against slavery, and then he just began writing to produce Common Sense. But Paine was very important. I wanted to make the point that this 18th century, the century of increasing technological virtuosity, was also accompanied by a new concept of human nature, human possibilities, and the proper ordering of government so that everyone would flourish. And that you have in Paine, and that I think you have in the Declaration of Independence, is, you know, drawing on that.
When you and I talked in 2000, you were an advisor to something called thomaspaine.com.
I'm not really an advisor. Yes, I am an advisor, but they don't ask for my advice very much.
Are they still active?
They're trying to get, yes, they are active, and they are still working on I think a television series. But they're still active. They write letters to the editor and whatnot.
Well, the reason I bring it up is because, as you know, a number of years ago we did a feature on Thomas Paine's one place, one shrine to him up in New Rochelle, New York, which isn't, and this is not criticism of them so much, it doesn't get a lot of support.
No.
You have been active in history for years and been one of the few people that's run both the Organization of American Historians and the American Historical Association. Right. I want to ask you about both of those organizations, but give me your views about history right now in this country and what people, I mean, what is the American people's view of history and how important is it? And has it changed, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
You probably know more about that than I do. You talk to more people, you know. I think history, judging from the books that sell, I just came from Los Angeles, the Festival of Books the LA Times has, just, you know, 100,000 people are there or more, reading books, buying books, listening to people talk about their books. I think there's a lot of interest in history. What I worry about is the fate of higher education in America. I think having achieved an absolutely first-class university educational system, just taking the private and the public universities together, we're just resting on our laurels, and their state universities are losing more and more state support. They're going out for private funds, so they're becoming more like private institutions. Tuition, California used to have a virtually free education. It's pretty expensive now, and that's how it affects students. But the way it affects history is that there is an underfunding of scholarship, and it's I don't know, it's very hard to promote an intangible like an understanding and appreciation of history or of art or of literature, and yet they are just fundamental to people's grasp of the world they live in, putting their world in the stream of time. So in that sense, I'm worried about history.
Kathleen Parker, who just won a Pulitzer for her column, I had a column recently, and I just use it for statistics, and she's talking about history and historical. She says America's growing historical illiteracy is well known to educators and policymakers. Then she says in 2006, for instance, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute tested the civic literacy of 14,000 freshmen and seniors at 50 colleges and universities. The average senior failed with a score of 54%.
You know, they've been doing these things for a long time. What do you think they would do if you, I mean, it's a tribute to history that they do it, but what do you think the score would be if you went out and tested their knowledge of biology or of chemistry?
About 10%.
Right. So, I know, you know, that doesn't bother me so much. Something that bothers me is you have what's going on in Texas now, and that's not university education, it's high school and middle school and elementary school, where they are rewriting the textbooks along a particular ideological line, and that's troubling. Again, it's a tribute to how important history is, that people would take the time to try and put in their ideas of what the revolutionary period was like.
But they think, obviously, that historians are telling the story
incorrectly.
Right. So how do you get around that?
It is kind of a problem because everybody thinks they know history, but no one would go say, look, Mr. Chemist, you don't have the slightest idea about the elemental table. Let me tell you what belongs in, you know. In other words, it's the accessibility of history that makes people experts. I suppose you get around it by having more and more opportunities to confront these people who say certain things about the writing of the Constitution or the pre-Civil War period with people who do know the documents, and so you can have some open forum. What you're trying to do is to persuade a third person. You're not going to persuade the historians that they're wrong. You're not going to persuade these people that they're wrong. But it's the spectator that needs to be convinced, and they could only be convinced, I think, by hearing this.
She quoted in another survey, Kathleen Parker, in a 1999 survey commissioned by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, 98% of students from 55 top colleges and universities could identify the rap singer Snoop Doggy Dogg, and 99% knew who Beavis and Butthead were. Again, it's that same thing.
Right,
these surveys, are they relevant? They matter?
Well, if they get people more interested in history education, yes. I mean, I don't know whether they're relevant, but I think they matter. And I think it would be nice if students retain. You know, I'll give you an example. Maybe I've said this before. I used to, when I taught lower division courses, I used to present a constitution that was opposite of our Constitution to get them to read the Constitution. This was a simple 20-list element. Everybody voted. It was purely democratic through and through, only one house of legislature. And then I would give it to them in advance and tell them to read both constitutions and come into class and be prepared to defend which one you want. I had to beg people to take my Constitution. And when they debated, they came up with all the answers, all the statements that were made in the Federalist Papers, which I don't think they'd read, but they knew why, in their view, a bicameral legislature was better. And they knew why you had an independent judiciary. And they knew, and it was very impressive. Now that told me something more than these polls did, that there is a general understanding of our institutions, but it's not something that you can spit out when someone asks you a question.
I mentioned that you had run these two, or had been elected to run these two historical institutions. Explain them. What's the difference between the Organization of American Historians, and when were you, what, chairman or president? President. When was it?
I was president in 88, I guess, 89. That is an organization for all scholars whose field is American history. So it has people in France who study American history, in Germany who study American history, in Japan, and China. The other is the American Historical Association, and that's an organization for all the historians in America.
And when were you, what were you, president of that or chairman?
Yes, I was president of that. You know, I was trying to think when I was president of that. I think it was 97. Yes, it was, 97.
And what do these organizations do for history?
They do a lot of good things for history. They obviously do two things that are important to their members. They have an annual meeting where there are all kinds of panel discussion. The latest scholarship is discussed, and they put out terrific journals of history scholarship, and the one is just American history, and the other is all kinds of history. But the American Historical Association in particular does a tremendous job of defending history in America, whether it might be an historian who is going to be fired because of some provocative study or access to the archives. There have been lots of legal issues in which they have become a party to a case which is going to open up the archives to the public or something to do with the Library of Congress. So they're always, they maintain an office here, and they're always alert to what it is that scholarship needs, and they do a tremendous job.
Back to your book on capitalism, how many countries in the world are not capitalists?
Well, Paul Collier says there are 57 failed states. Now, whether they are not capitalists, I don't know, but they're probably not doing it very well if they're failed states. So I'll give you those 57.
But do you call China a capitalist country?
Yes, definitely.
When did it become a capitalist country?
Well, it started in 78 with the liberalization program. It's, kind of very hard to say when it became, but when you have them allowing peasants to sell their land and put their land up for collateral and farm individually, which happened about in the last 12 years. I mean, they said they could only do it for 30 years, but no one thinks they'll ever resume it. That's a major change. Farming is always key because it involves the most people and the most traditional element in the society. They've expanded their, free trading zones, their banks. China gets an enormous amount of, what do they call it, of private money from Chinese all over the world. And so they have this as a source of investment. They have, I think they're called money clubs for startups. They still run the big industries, but even those big industries are now being run on a profit basis. And they're pouring their profits back into the pension funds, which they don't have. So I would say, after the last 10, 12 years.
So for what you know about capitalism, can they continue to be a communist country for very long?
I think it's going to be hard. And the reason it's going to be hard is because a part of their communism, it's not so much communism, but their authoritarianism is controlling information. And information is absolutely critical to capitalist development. This is a fast-moving technological world, and you need to have access to it. And you don't know where innovations are going to come from. Your people need to have access to these things. And I would say in the foreseeable future, the next quarter century, we're going to see more and more of an easing up. Whether they have a bi-party system, I don't know, but they're going to ease up on the control of individual lives, as they are already.
Go back to what you said about your own interest about poverty and eradicating poverty and having a more equal society. Is there a country in the world that's more equal than this one?
Well, I think, yes. I think Sweden and Finland, I think these countries have a tremendously strong social net. The Gini coefficient, as they say, measuring the inequality. I was looking at The Economist last night on the plane. It's very low in Finland as compared to the United States, and Britain's more than the United States, and China and India are worse than the United States in the spread of wealth. But a part of that is a function of the fact that there's so much wealth at the top. Before, everybody was poor. It's not that the poor have gotten poorer, it's that there are many more well-off people, so you have this spread of inequality. Yes, I would say those Scandinavian countries, probably the Netherlands, where they do a much better job, a much stronger support of labor participating on corporate boards, and they're economically strong and getting stronger. I mean,
what about the fact they're more homogeneous than this country?
Yes, that's true.
By a long shot.
By a long shot. They all have now some pocket of guest workers that have stayed put and offer some variety of the vanilla, which dominates. But that is a very important factor. But I don't think it's insurmountable.
And you go to Japan, it's the same thing.
Well, Japan is pretty extreme because they really are xenophobic, I think. They really, they really are uncomfortable around strangers. But look at it this way. We're heterogeneous, but we're used to that. Does it bother me that I go on the UCLA campus and I can see every skin color in the world? Not at all. I mean, it isn't threatening. So that over time, over time, that's going to be like homogeneity. Now we're still having some difficulty with immigrants and concern about them in some parts of the country.
So you mentioned Adam Smith, and then we went to Thomas Paine, and we talked a little bit about the Declaration of Independence. I want to go back to that time. What role did capitalism play in the creation of this country?
Well, this country was tied to the absolute front runner, Great Britain. And so they had been economically active and innovative from the very beginning in Massachusetts and Virginia. In Virginia, unfortunately, it was a slave system, but it's highly capital intensive. In Massachusetts, it was much more plucky entrepreneur. And this meant that it fostered this individualism, and individual initiative and individual responsibility. Those are kind of the moral bedrock of capitalism. You have to take care of yourself, and you have to act on your own. So I think they had a lot to do with causing the revolution. People felt competent. When the British try and change the rules, they're not at all happy about it, and they're not afraid to oppose it. And so I would say that economic initiative, maybe I won't say capital, economic initiative was, widespread economic initiative was critical to the revolution and to the founding of the country.
What about slavery? You mentioned that. Talk about it in your book. Slavery, not just for this country, but from around the world.
In the Caribbean, right. Slavery is a terrible thing. It shows what greed will do. There were these profits to be made in the tropics by growing sugar. Imagine a world without sugar, and all of a sudden they could get sugar. And this led to this really vicious exploitation of labor. What's really, to me, is tragic about slavery is that it weighed on the conscience of these European countries. So what did they do? They blamed the condition on the slaves. It was their qualities. They were sort of Aristotelian. They were meant to be slaves. And this has left this bitter legacy of prejudice, which is put in there in the first place to salve the conscience of the slave owners.
And tobacco. Tobacco played what role in capitalism in this country?
Well, tobacco was the underpinning of the southern slave economy, tobacco and rice in South Carolina in the 18th century. It was then replaced by cotton, which was even more valuable as an export, more demand for it. So it gave slavery a lease on life. Slavery was going strong all the way up to 1860, but by this time the conscience of the world and the North was such that there was an absolute insistence that it not be spread. That's what the Civil War was about. It was not slavery where it was, but it was the spread of slavery. The North said no, and the South would not accept that. So I think it had in the long term, a very malign impact. In the short term, it was very important to Northern prosperity because the South concentrated their labor and their land on cotton, and they bought everything else from the North. So this is, it's got this giant buyer, as it were. Cheap clothes, cheap shoes, food, barrel staves, the works.
Unions. When did they first start in this country? And why, and you mentioned this earlier, that it was not a very unionized country overall. Was there about 12, 13 million out of 309 million people?
The second half of the 19th century, you have the Knights of Labor, and then, then you have the AFL, Gompers in 1886, I think, starts it. And then you had the Wobblies. You had anarchists who were involved in labor agitation. I think there are lots of reasons why it didn't succeed in this country. One of them is that this individual initiative that I talked about, that's just hardwired in the American psyche. There's a dislike of collective action. We're all hang together and do this thing. It just seems sort of un-American. The other thing is that America had this incredible flood of immigrants starting in the 1880s. And these immigrants came and took the jobs in the factory and pushed up people who were born in America into white-collar jobs or into foremanships or one. So to organize the basic labor, you had to organize people who were just trying to get assimilated in this country, just trying to learn the language. It was extremely hard. Someone like Gompers was successful because he specialized, not initially, but then he specialized in skilled labor, and he discriminated. They discriminated against blacks. They looked upon women as nothing but strike breakers. And so he had a group of unions that were looking out for themselves. And he was a master psychologist, and he understood capitalism. His view with what he wanted was more. And when we get more, we're going to want more. And he shrewdly saw that the workers were the best customers for America's industries. Here's a mass market, and if you pay them well, you'll have a great group of consumers. People had not recognized that. It had been brooded about before, but the sense that if you're always driving down wages, you are destroying your market. And Gompers seized on that, and that's why he succeeded. And of course, then later we had the John Lewis and the CIO, which was a more unskilled laborers. And eventually you do have the labor unions doing well, but really not until the late 1930s.
If you take, though, the 3 million teachers out of the unions and the state workers and all, you've got very few unions left in the industrial world.
7.5.
Yeah. Why do you think that's happened?
I think competitiveness. I think because the major employers, what is the major employer? It's Walmart. And they have made a success from a lot of things, from their fascinating use of technology, but also keeping wages low. It's very different from Walter Reuther's day, in which wages were high, and there were all those good jobs in the steel mill and the auto plants. But America was protected. There wasn't the same competition. There wasn't this flow of capital around the world. So while I wish Walmart would change its ways and pay more, I recognize that it was in a different economic environment, and it succeeded brilliantly in that economic environment.
Has there ever been a country in the world that succeeded without capitalism? From a
economic point of view?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I mean, there are countries that succeeded. You know, probably went to New Guinea and into tribes, or in the Amazon basin, there are groups that feed themselves, that have enough of the way of life they want, and those are economies. But in terms of prospering, getting more goods, enjoying a higher standard of living, no.
So how do you explain? I know you did a segment on Walmart. How do you explain Walmart in the capitalist system? How does that happen?
Well, you had a brilliant strategist who saw Sam Walton was just a master of introducing efficiencies. He's like Henry Ford. They're just brilliant organizers. They're businessmen, but they see these possibilities. You know, there's a lot of squeezing over prices and wages, but there's also this use of technology, never sending out trucks that don't come back full. They've got, they used information technology to be constantly telling the trucks where to go. You know, if they discover that one system of tagging boxes in their yard where they have their inventory isn't as effective as another, they replace the other. And as someone said, Walmart keeps every employee on a very tight technological leash. Every sale goes into the accountant's office, the inventory, the planning. I mean, there's just no slippage there. That's it's kind of a brilliant plan.
We're going to get more of Walmarts or less in the future?
I think we're going to get more Walmarts. I think it's very interesting that Home Depot and Target and one or two others are in the top 50 Fortune 500 clubs. Fortune 500 companies. So Walmart has had successful imitators too.
So where do you put the stock market in all this?
Costco. Where do I put the stock market in all that?
In a capitalist system.
Well, I think it's absolutely essential for the companies to, when they want to raise money, it also gives an enormous number of people a chance to participate in the profits that are generated by companies. I don't know how you could, I suppose there's another way to do it. I don't think there's a more efficient way to share the ownership and to have access to the capital.
In studying the history of capitalism, where does the recent 2008, 2009 financial problems we've had fall into history?
Well, I think it's another one of those panics, bubble burst, that is the result of the fact that no one is in charge, and you had a very strong sense of incentives that were pulling people into riskier and riskier behavior. And you had a government that was complicit, one deregularizing the banks and also pushing for home ownership in a kind of mindless way. When I heard that there were NINA loans, no income, no assets, I realized that they really had, you know, just thrown all caution to the winds. So I think it's a convergence. Capitalism does not correct itself. It needs regulation, and it was a great failure. I think we'll always have panics, but as someone pointed out very recently, we had controlled most of the recessions up until 2008, since the recession, and we'd done it because of the Federal Reserve System. We'd done it because of mechanisms we had in place. It just didn't work this time around.
So if you had to nominate somebody to be the most successful capitalist in history, who would you put there on top?
Oh, I don't. Maybe Josiah Wedgwood.
Who was?
No, he was a ceramics maker, china maker in England, and he took a very lazy, kind of ill-organized set of pottery workers. The potteries in England was composed of all little workshops. He brought them together. He made this lovely china. The Queen of Russia wanted 1,000 plates with different scenes from Greek mythology on them, and he was just desperate because he didn't have the artists to produce this. And he did finally produce the order, but then he realized, I need to have a school, and I need to get gifted teenagers to begin to design and paint. So he's like Walton or Ford or one of these people that see the industry whole from the very beginning of making it, the product, and then marketing it. Ford would probably have to be another one, because Ford, I mean, not only did he see the possibility of a cheap car, but he saw the possibility of selling his own cars. He had set up 7,000 dealerships by 1910, I think. So I think that's the really impressive capitalist, is where you have the integration of the whole system in one person. Tom Watson is another one, IBM.
There are more that you can read about in Joyce Appleby's book, The Relentless Revolution, A History of Capitalism, and we're out of time, and I thank you very much.
I thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts, or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.
Up next, remarks by new British